Hello, biology crew. So we have our next set of notes, which is on some inheritance patterns. So let's get started. Okay, so the objective today, we're actually not going to cover the entire thing. I did the PowerPoint and then decided it was way too long for one day's worth of work. So today we're just going to talk about incomplete dominance and codominance. And next time we'll talk about polygenic inheritance and sex-linked traits. So here we have an example of an alternative inheritance pattern, and you'll see that later. Isn't that pretty? All right, so on the discussion question on the wiser me, go ahead and answer the prompt. The reality is that there's only a handful of traits, somewhere between 13 and 18 maybe, that of human traits that show that pure dominant, pure recessive. In one of our videos, we talked about earlobes being one of those things. Widow's peak is another one. Whether you can roll your tongue is a pure dominant, pure recessive trait, whether you're double jointed and hitchhiker's thumb. But there's really just a few things, a few traits that show that pure dominance, pure recessive. So can you think of any other types? Well, I mentioned them in the objectives. There you go. All right. So there are 5 main types of inheritance patterns. These are the 5 that we're going to talk about. There are others. In terms of genetics and Punnett squares and how you inherit the genes and the traits that you have, what we are talking about here is like a tiny sliver off of a giant iceberg. I mean, we're not even covering like what's above water. Like we got like a tiny little sliver of genetics here. It really is just an introduction. There is so much more to genetics that we just can't cover. Honestly, I wish there was like a biology 2 class for sophomores that's optional that would just go in depth in all of these really cool things that we just don't have time to cover. All right, off my soapbox. So you have already talked about and are very familiar with the first one listed here, the pure dominant, pure recessive. This is the one where the dominant allele covers up the recessive allele, and the recessive allele is only expressed if there are 2 copies of that recessive allele. Today we're going to talk about incomplete dominance and codominance, which are also kind of like relationships between alleles. And then number 4 and number 5 are something a little bit different. They're not necessarily relationship between alleles, but they are the expression of a trait. So here's kind of a summary of that. So alleles that we talk about will either be pure dominant, pure recessive, incomplete dominance, or codominance. So number 1 through 3. And then we talk about traits. And traits can be single allele traits, which I said there's very few of them, right? Like there's widow's peak and earlobes and all of the other traits, all of the other genes in your body fall under things like polygenic traits, multiple alleles, and sex-linked traits, all of those things. So we talk about number 4 and 5 are about the traits themselves. And the alleles that make up those traits can show any of these. 1, 2, 3. All right. So here we go. Incomplete dominance. This is the reason why it's called incomplete. If you think about it, if you have one allele that's bright pink, this kind of reddish color, or fuchsia, and then another allele that's white, if you were to mix those together, if neither one is completely dominant over the other, if it's only incompletely dominant, so kind of dominant over the other color, then you get a mix. You get somewhere in between. And this one is really and truly a mix. So this is an intermediate phenotype, meaning a mix between the two. the dominant allele isn't able to fully express itself. Typically, the darker colors exhibit dominance over lighter colors. So when we make the Punnett square, we're still going to use capital letters and lowercase letters. So for this case, when you create the Punnett square for incomplete dominance, we're going to use the darker color just as a convention, just as something that makes it sort of similar. We're going to use the darker color as with the capital letter, even though it's incomplete dominance, and then the lighter color, in this case, white, with the lowercase letter. So if you were to breed the red flower and the white flower, you get some intermediate color in their offspring. All of their offspring are heterozygous, so they will all be pink. You will see this written sometimes. Don't do this. You should have one letter for one trait, one letter for one trait. In this case, the trait is color. We don't want to do R and W because then it starts feeling like a dihybrid cross, and that is not okay. This is still a monohybrid cross. We're not looking at two different traits. So if you look up pictures for incomplete dominance and even for codominance, they do this thing where they are using two different letters. Don't do that. It's confusing. Okay. I'll show you some ways to indicate the codominance in the next slide, but don't do this, even if you see it online. So we look at this Punnett square, and the percentage is it's 100% heterozygous. The ratio is just 1. They're all the same. So for incomplete dominance, let's do an example cross. In fact, on the Wiser Me worksheet, you have a place where you can fill this in. So go ahead and do that now. We are going to cross two heterozygous parents. So what if they're both pink for these flowers? What would the offspring look like? All right, welcome back. Here's the Punnett square for this. We have the two heterozygous parents at the top. When we fill those in, we see that 25% are homozygous dominant, 25% are homozygous recessive, and then 50% are heterozygous. When writing ratios for monohybrid crosses, you always write them with the dominant first, the homozygous dominant first, and the homozygous recessive at the end. The heterozygous always goes in the middle. So knowing that, our answer would be 50% heterozygous, 25% homozygous recessive, 25% homozygous dominant. And our ratio, again, if we use this formula where the homozygous dominant is first, it's a 1-to-1 ratio. So what about codominance? Codominance is really cool. Here's the difference. I like this picture of the flowers, so take a look here. The flowers show the difference between codominance and incomplete dominance. In this case, you have a red flower and a white flower that make a pink one. And this is incomplete dominance. If it's codominance and you mix a red and a white flower, you end up with a flower that expresses both alleles. You actually see both traits. So in the case of chickens, the speckled chicken, it's actually called, you can actually look them up. They're like blue chickens, or Andalusian chickens are what they're called. And they're not really speckled or spotted. It's just that you have some white little wispies on each feather and some black ones. And so they look like this cool grayish color. And then for roosters, you see that if you mix the black rooster and the white rooster, you end up with a mix of both colors. You see both the white feathers and the black feathers in the offspring. So the definition is a condition in which both alleles are fully expressed. You see both phenotypes, not a mix, but you see both phenotypes. Next, I want you to notice how you write this. Because they're codominant, they are both dominant. So they both have to have capital letters. In this case, you can write So they've done an F here for feathers. So the feathers are black. Okay, so they put the capital B there. Here the feathers are white. Okay, so then you can tell the feathers, and you do this by doing a superscript, if you're familiar with that in Word or in Google Docs. It's a superscript, kind of like an exponent. So you have an F for feathers, and then the exponent with a capital B for black feathers, and an F with a capital W exponent for the white feathers. Here they chose the letter C for chicken, I guess. So the chicken with black feathers and the chicken with white feathers. And here you can clearly see that it's one trait, it's feathers, but you have two different alleles, the black and the white, and both are being expressed. So this one, just like the previous slide, 100% heterozygous. So you have something else that occurs with Andalusian chickens and roan animals. You can have a roan horse. And what this means, so it's got the title up here, roan. This pattern is called a roan horse. It's when you have a codominant situation between black and white hairs on the body of the horse. You may have patches of darker or patches of lighter, but from a distance, it looks like this bluish smoky color. And in horses, it's called a blue roan. That would be the coat color or the coat type. And you can also have a mix between white hairs and brown hairs on the horse, and you end up with what's called a strawberry roan, because it's actually the brown hairs and the white hairs right next to each other, and from a distance it gives it this sort of pinkish color, and so it's called strawberry roan. So let's take a look at an example cross where we have, it's not, so we've got something different. So we've got the roan horse with black hair and white hair. So this would be a roan, a blue roan. And we're going to mix our blue roan horse with a white horse. So what we do is we draw our Punnett square, and we put one parent up here. There's our roan horse that has this one right here that has black hairs and white hairs. And then we have our white horse over here with only white hairs. And then we mix them together, and here's what you get. If you need to pause the video and fill in your notes, you can. So then we take a look at the phenotypes and the genotypes. So here we have two heterozygous individuals. They're going to be roan, just like their parent. And then we have two white offspring as well, which are going to be like this parent. So 50% blue roan, 50% white. A ratio is 1 to 1. So if you count these up, it would be 2 to 2, and then you reduce it 1 to 1. We don't have the homozygous dominant, so we just have those two. And you don't have to explain what the ratio means. It should be evident to the person who's looking at it, which in your case would be me. And that's it. So let me know if you have questions, and have a good day.